Welcome back to Social Psychology. In this section, we're talking about living in a prejudiced world, and we're going to wrestle with just a few ideas about why it's so hard to live in a diverse society and how that might play out for folks. So, we're going to get into some things that probably feel, if they haven't already in this class, feel challenging in some way or controversial or something like that. My hope is that it will continue to be worth it. So let's take a look at a few ideas. You might have come across research before on how diversity of individuals' backgrounds tends to benefit a company, a school, right? Like it is a measurable improvement when you have people coming from diverse backgrounds. There's a measurable improvement in like the quality of their decision making, their creativity, their productivity. So generally speaking, diversity is good for a group or a society. One of the things that has also been found is that it tends to increase, kind of along the same lines, it makes the pie bigger. So if we're thinking about opportunity, income, resources, gross domestic product, working alongside people with diverse backgrounds helps societies expand the pie and makes them more creative and wealthier. So that's the good news. The bad news is, or the challenging news maybe, I don't know if it's bad news, but let's see. So greater diversity has a different effect on how the pie is split. So when there is greater diversity in thinking about racial, ethnic, and religious diversity, people tend to be open to providing public assistance or sharing pieces of that pie to people in need if they believe that most of those people in need are from their own group, from their own racial, ethnic, or religious group. They tend to be less open if they think other groups are benefiting primarily or more. We also see that across many nations, greater ethnic diversity tends to be correlated with less social trust. So I think part of a piece of that that we can connect to back to our social identity theory, thinking about outgroups in less favorable terms, and that's what happens here. So good news, diversity comes with more positive things that we like, creativity and wealth, for example, but it also tends to come along with um, a preference not to share that greater creativity and wealth. When researchers have tried to look into what makes being in a diverse group or diverse society difficult, one of the things that demographers, people looking at our US population, note that the United States is going to become a majority minority country in the coming decades. So that means that the people racialized as white are still going to be the largest group, but they're not going to be more than 50% of the US population. That's the expectation given the current trends. Now, when researchers made white Americans aware of that, they called it a racial shift condition and said, here, this racial shift is going to happen by 2042. You notice that those participants felt more or less warmly towards racial minority groups, Black Americans, Latinx Americans, and Asian Americans, than they did white Americans. So you notice the difference here. There's a significant difference in how warmly participants tended to feel towards racial minority groups when they thought of them, when they thought of their own group no longer being the majority. So there's a sense around this, there's a sense of threat, of losing one's place that is commonly associated with studies like this. Because if they talk about other kinds of trends in the demographics of the United States and the control condition, you see some differences there between racial groups, but that threat seems to make a significant difference as well. So potentially white Americans especially feel a lot of discomfort around changing racial demographics. It also tends to that idea of changing racial demographics in the United States tends to have impacts on how people identify politically as well. So in this study, when they were told, when participants are told that California recently became a majority minority state, the researchers in this case are looking at how does that impact individuals' political affiliations. So white participants leaned more conservative when they thought that, or it was brought to their attention that California became a majority minority state. They tended to lean more Republican or conservative. So, and the opposite is true when they didn't mention such that kind of when they said, so here we go, that the Hispanic population in the United States is equal to the Black population, which doesn't have any bearing. It doesn't reflect on the participants' own racial group membership, their white majority experience. So this is, we want to put a study like this in lots of context. But if you think about Republican political affiliation as being conservative, and think about the basic idea of conservatism, not necessarily the way it's being politicized in this moment, which could be different than how it's being politicized when I'm recording this, but it's going back to or kind of a return to preserving a person's culture or societal arrangement. Conservatism is holding on to, it's kind of opposed to progress or being progressive. Right? So one of the explanations for this is that it makes people terribly uncomfortable. It makes people who've been in the majority, people who've been racialized as white in the United States, very uncomfortable, and so wanting to kind of have a return to or go back to conserve the status quo. One of the questions that people often grapple with is, why do we have such different perceptions and feelings about inequality and the progress that has been made? And if we focus in the United States, sticking here again, different racialized groups have different estimates or of progress. One reason why that might be is sometimes called the Marley hypothesis. Yes, it's in reference to Bob Marley, saying that different racial groups make different assessments of the amount of racism in society because they differ in their knowledge of racial history. So the dominant group, and that often happens when a group is dominant or a majority in a society, they often know less about the history of oppression and disadvantage suffered by marginalized groups. And so there are lots of examples of this. People can assess our familiarity or our knowledge about inequities in the United States. And one example of this I think is pretty striking is they asked people in this study to estimate Black family wealth when white wealth is $100. So it puts it kind of in terms of percent in some ways. And if you look at the actual, the economists have been keeping track of things like that for a long time, it's quite low. It is hovering around maybe 10%, far less than 50%. But if you look at the perceived wealth of Black families when white families is 100, right? So if all things were equitable, everybody would be at the 100 mark. So we have the perception is that there is more equity or that Black families are getting closer over time when in actuality it has stayed the same and low. So these are just a couple of different ways of trying to get at what might make it difficult for us to see each other's perspective. For example, what might make it hard especially when a person is a member of a dominant group, some things are not as apparent or visible because they're not part of our everyday experience or they're not part of our personal experience with those societal structures. So that gets into lots of bigger questions. And hopefully, some of this helps you sort through some of the facts and explanations that social psychology can provide. And I expect it will also leave you with questions about so what? What do we want to do with all this information? What should we be doing next? And I would expect lots of different answers from different folks. I would be curious to hear your thoughts, any questions you might have. And as always, thanks so much for being with me here.